The first humans who spread out of Africa were distinct from those who stayed in Africa. So humans, both biologically and mimetically, that is culturally, traditionally, were suited to the ecology of Africa. Now you can say, or you can argue, that Africa is easier or harder to live in than, say, Brazil, or say Asia, or say Europe. But of course you couldn't leave Africa and go straight to any of these climates. You had to go through the Middle East. Now, in terms of agriculturalism, we think of the Fertile Crescent, we think of the Garden of Eden, we think of agriculturalism, and we think of the Middle East as a foundation of civilization. The problem is, humans didn't leave Africa with a knowledge of agriculture. Humans left Africa as hunter-gatherers. And, you know, mainstream anthropology says that humans left 80,000 years ago. That might be true, that might be false. And of course that's a confusing question, since we can and we have interbred with Neanderthals. So when we say humans left Africa and entered Europe 40,000 years ago, when we say something like that, are we talking about Neanderthals as being human beings? Well, we are at least partially Neanderthal, so that's a confusing question. But, again, distinguishing Neanderthals from Homo sapiens for a second, Homo sapiens, again, mainstream reports, left Africa between 100,000 and 80,000 years ago. And they had to go up through the Sahara, and they had to go up through the Arabian Peninsula. And the Sahara and the Arabian Peninsula, not really good places to go if you're a hunter-gatherer. If you're a hunter-gatherer and you look at a map of Africa, there is sort of a fertile range which is between the Sahara, so sub-Saharan, and then we're talking about north of Botswana, basically. And in between that range, humans are supposedly, Homo sapiens are supposed to have originated somewhere near Ethiopia, or somewhere within Ethiopia. And so that range is kind of the perfect climatological, ecological range for us, south of the Sahara and north of something like Botswana. South of Botswana gets very dry. Now today with agriculturalism, there has been a lot of Dutch-descended and European-descended utilization of South Africa and of Botswana and of former Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. But there's a difference between good agricultural conditions, good conditions for the soil, and good conditions for a early Homo sapiens hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So an early Homo sapiens hunter-gatherer lifestyle lends itself more to, you know, regions that are a little bit more rainy, a little less dry. You're less worried about the soil conditions. Really, what you're looking for as a hunter-gatherer is you're looking more for fish as a resource. So you're looking for streams, you're looking for ponds, you're looking for bodies of water, oceans, so you're looking for fish. And you're looking for plains where you might have bison-type animals, antelopes, whatever, some kind of animal that you can hunt. You're also looking for plains because for a Homo sapiens, being in the jungle is kind of a dangerous place to be, where you have wild animals, jaguars or whatever, that can sneak up on you. If you're on the plains, you can more easily mount a defense, and you have the advantage of ranged weapons. So having plains is good in that sense. Although, you know, in Europe, there is like a forest-dwelling kind of Homo sapien, but we're trying to go back, we're trying to look at the original habitat and understand what was the niche that humanity grew into. again, whether it's a good niche or a bad niche, like we could say it's harder to live in Alaska than in Africa. Like by objective means, like we could measure the number of calories you have to ingest every day to survive in Alaska versus Africa and say, okay, well, objectively, you're consuming more resources, it's harder, there's more physical work, more joules being consumed in Alaska. But we're going to ignore that for a moment and understand that when you adapt to a certain niche, it is always easier to continue that niche than to speciate and grow out of it and go into a different niche. So there was an African niche, and the people who populated South Africa were not Zulus, they were not African Americans, they were not, what is the politically correct term? They were not Congolese type peoples, they were not black type peoples. These were pygmy type peoples, and you have pictures of these people who are like 4 foot tall. Now, why were there these 4 foot tall people in South Africa? Why is it that these very, very small people were living in South Africa? Well, there's actually, this isn't an isolated thing. Hobbits, or really short Homo sapiens, are something that have existed all over the world, and you can study their previous existence. They've basically been wiped out. And they've been hunted, and they've actually been eaten by their fellow Africans, you know, because they'll eat anything that they think is, and I mean, the Chinese are the same way, right? Chinese are always trying to eat, like, dragon tail, or tiger tails, and, like, hunt rare species, right? So they're trying to eat things and people that might give them supernatural powers. And the pygmies have been wiped out, but how did they survive for so long? If they're physically inferior in stature and they can't compete in war with Homo sapiens, how did they survive? Well, they survived because Homo sapiens didn't want to go into South Africa because it wasn't a good climate for hunting and gathering in the niche that Homo sapiens had grown into. So there was kind of this southern limit, then there was a northern limit. But there was this tribe, or tribes, perhaps, we don't know exactly. The anthropological evidence is in dispute, but there was some group or groups of Homo sapiens that did choose to leave sub-Saharan Africa, to brave the Sahara, to brave the Arabian Peninsula, which again, you can say, oh, well, the Nile River Valley is so good for agriculture. I don't care. It's not good for hunting and gathering. You can say, oh, the Tigris and the Euphrates, they're so good for agriculture. Well, again, I don't care about the richness of the soil and the productivity of the soil. What I care about is, can a species which has fallen into this niche of hunting and gathering in the sub-Saharan environment, can it survive in these desert environments with these little oases? And there was a group of people who decided to do that. And if you're not an African, or you have any non-African descent or ancestry, then you are a descendant of these people who chose to leave sub-Saharan Africa. And you can actually, it's kind of similar in the way that you look at the Pacific Islanders, and they are obese today on average because their ancestors had to island hop from basically mainland Asia to make it all the way out to Hawaii, which is an incredibly long journey, and somehow they made it. And there were, this spirit of exploration, there were certain Africans who didn't have it and others who did. And the ones who had it to the most extreme, they were the ones who broke through the desert of the Sahara and the desert of Arabia, and they pushed through to the Mediterranean, and they pushed through to ancient Phoenicia, which today is Israel. Very important place geographically in terms of the way it's set up. You look at northern Israel, which really, historically, biblical Israel, the Negev, southern Israel, is not fertile, it's not important. No one cares about that. What's important is northern Israel. We're talking about even Lebanon, even Syria, the Golan. You go to these places, they're very fertile. They're beautiful places, actually. So, I mean, it almost reminds me of Ireland, how rocky and how fertile and how green and how rainy it is all the time. But we do have historical records that the extent of the Neanderthals, supposedly, the most southern extent of the Neanderthals reached this area. Why? Because if you look at the desert environment of the Negev, that's not something Neanderthals were suited to. Neanderthals were, again, hunter-gatherers, but like the sub-Saharan African Homo sapiens, they had a certain niche. And that niche was cold, forest, plains. They had a certain climatological niche that they fit into, and the desert repelled them. So they spread from Ireland, or at least Spain. They spread from Spain to China. That was the extent of it. But they did not really go south of the Negev. And so they had no way to reach those sub-Saharan Africans. Instead, some groups of sub-Saharan Africans traveled north, and once they went past the Negev, they started to encounter these Neanderthals. So this whole story that we're setting up here, we kind of know how it goes, right? Eventually the Neanderthals get wiped out, but there is a trace of Neanderthal DNA in non-sub-Saharan Africans, and it ranges in different populations. It ranges in different expressions. So, for instance, we can talk about ancestry with dog breeds. We could talk about humanity. But we can see how different traits might be isolated. So we can talk about the physiognomy of the Neanderthal having a strong brow ridge. And so if you see someone with a really strong brow ridge, you might say, well, that's a person where that trait, that Neanderthal trait of having a strong brow ridge, it was isolated, and then it was reinforced through sexual selection, in that people with strong brow ridges were selecting each other in a certain selection pattern. In the same way that, like, we see peacocks develop a sexual preference for the plumage of the male peacock, we could see, like, human females just sort of out of, random stochastic effects, or some kind of patterning emerges where they're looking for men with strong brow ridges because that helps those men win fights. If you get punched in the face and you have a strong brow ridge, your face isn't going to be hurt. The guy's knuckles are going to be broken. You're not going to get a black eye. The guy's knuckles will be broken. So there's a selection for that, and you can see modern Homo sapiens who have this very strong brow ridge, and you can say, okay, that's an isolated trait that ultimately can be traced back to Neanderthals. Now, is that really a Neanderthal trait on the genetic level? Well, that's kind of hard to determine, because the genes which control the size of different aspects of your skull can change over time, and we could use selective breeding or sexual pressures to artificially engineer larger brow ridges. And you could even imagine a situation in which someone had no Neanderthal ancestry, but they still developed a strong brow ridge through selective pressure. In that case, it would be an example of convergent evolution and not direct Neanderthal ancestry. So again, it's a difficult question, but today we're having a mix of basically biopsychologists looking at genetics and saying, okay, there's a link between Neanderthal DNA and certain diseases. There's a link between Neanderthal DNA and perhaps traits of autism. Those are tenuous right now. It's hard to research, but we can see the linkage there. So our past, our Neanderthal past, our ancient past isn't destroyed. It's still there. It's still living with us today. Even on a psychological basis, I think the other diseases were things like bipolar. And I mean, these diseases, given if you have a person with sufficient intelligence and they have a disease like bipolar or some kind of madness, some kind of insanity, it can actually produce some very creative results because they're thinking outside the box. They're not constrained like most people are within rationality. And so they're able to maybe create something that is worthwhile and beneficial for other people. And I'm kind of thinking of Nietzsche here. He kind of went mad at the end of his life. But he did have interesting things to say, and we can learn from Nietzsche. So this is still with us. Our Neanderthal past is still with us. The ancient past we're talking about, perhaps 100,000 years ago, or at least tens of thousands of years ago, that's still with us. And so when we talk about now nationalism, and I think of nationalism primarily as a phenomenon of the 19th century, but then we look at like deeper what is meant by the nation. Okay, well the Greeks talked about natio, or the I should say the Romans talked about natio as meaning birth, the nation, and then for the Greeks it was ethnos, the tribe. So, or genes is another term for tribe in Greek, and that's where we get genetic from. But genes, ethnos, natio, so these are origins of the nation, and that's where nationalism as a political system comes into play. But even if nationalism is not the basis of the entire political system, even if it's a monarchy, a democracy, a republic, so on and so forth, still nationalism as a force is still present. Because animals have this thing called sex. And so animals are always looking for mating partners. And in order to find your mating partner, you have to distinguish between species. Because if you're a horse and you spend all your time trying to mate with donkeys, then you're going to end up producing a lot of non-fertile offspring. So it's very important, as any animal species, to be able to distinguish between who is in your breeding population, who is not in your breeding population. Furthermore, as a species advances and has greater powers of discernment, has greater powers in its five senses, its ability to recognize visual information and construct a symbology, either instinctually or through learned behavior, through pattern recognition, able to recognize, okay, this specimen of my mating population has a greater survival chance than this specimen, therefore I want to mate with this one over that one. Now for males, this is not such an issue in a lot of species, because the males will just mate with they'll try to mate with every female of the species. However, there are limits to this. So a female who is sick, a female who is dying, a female who is old, or a female who is too young for mating. If the male wastes his time, resources, energy trying to pursue females that are infertile or dying, then that's going to be a bad sexual strategy. So already on a very fundamental level, basic level in animal psychology, I would say you have to have this ability for discernment between who is a good mating partner, who's a bad mating partner. And for the females, this is even more important than for the males. Generally, again, because of the way essentially that pregnancy works, this is the case among a huge amount of mammals. Now, you can find exceptions. Oh, well, for spiders, it's different. Actually, the female's like trying to like eat the male, and all these weird things. Like, I understand there are radically different types of animals out there and insects and everything that I'm saying. Oh, well, some animals are gay, dolphins are gay, and like, okay. All right, but let's just try to form some heuristics here. Let's try to understand this in a very simplistic way, because all those exceptions are distracting from my main point, which exceptions do not disprove a general rule. There is still, when you look at a bunch of dots on a screen, like your computer screen or phone or whatever you're looking at, there are a bunch of little pixels, and if I had some virus in your computer or something messed up a few of the pixels, you would still be able to see the general picture, and you'd be able to say, okay, well, I'm looking at a person talking right now. Just because a few pixels are messed up doesn't mean that is not true in the general sense. So you can point out the individual expectation. Oh, well, these species do things differently. Okay, well, still, we have a general picture. We have a general symbology of how animal species work, especially mammals. Humans are mammals. So we come to this point now where nationalism and ethnocentrism and preference for people of your ethnicity, of your language, of your culture, of your breeding patterns, of your values, of your religion, all of these in-groups and psychological in-groups, the desire to mate and be around people and form communities with people is always a sexual act. If I say, let's say I go up to a person and I say, hey, I want you to be my roommate. Now, in the modern world, if I have sex with someone and I use contraceptive, it doesn't mean that anyone's going to get pregnant. In fact, there's a very low chance that someone's going to get pregnant. On the other hand, someone can go to a sperm bank, get pregnant with no sex required. So sex has really become divorced from reproduction. However, instinctually, if I say, I want you to be my roommate, what does that mean 10,000 years ago? What does that mean 100,000 years ago? What it means is, I want you to be a part of my breeding population. And that means that if I have a daughter or a son, then I would be cool with your daughters and your sons mating together. Now, if we're of the same ancestral background, that's good sense. But if we're of opposed ancestries, then that can be problematic. Again, this basic instinct of animals, I should say, they want to not only find a breeding partner that's going to produce fertile offspring, but they want to choose the best breeding partner. And Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene, he lays this out, how you have this desire for propagation, you have the desire then for altruism to help fellow members of your group. That's where we get the concept of the concept of in-groups and loving each other and altruism, they're all very much intertwined. And you can't really have one without the other. Without this concept of in-groups, we cannot have a concept of altruism. Without the concept of like, hey, you're part of my in-group, then we can't also have the concept of love. So the smallest in-group is really the relationship between a mother and her offspring. That's the smallest in-group. And that's where altruism starts, where the mother, in a K-selective way, and it's a sliding spectrum of K-selection and R-selection, but she shows care toward her offspring. That's altruism. That is the selfish gene expressing itself in the behavior of the animal. And so the bigger our in-group, the bigger our altruism, but still the basic animal desire to say like, hey, you look similar to me, we're part of the genetic in-group of Europeans, we're the Africans, we're the Asians, whatever, and you can get more specific than that. And it can be transracial, so you can say, okay, you're white and I'm black, whatever, but we both have strong brow ridges, we both have masculine traits, we're both manly men, we both vote Republican, we're both evangelical Christians. So there are all these things that are signals to us that even though our skin color is different, we're so similar in these other ways that we say, okay, we're an in-group. And so race in itself, or skin color, is not really the only characteristic that humans use to determine, are you in my in-group, in my genetic in-group. It is a powerful one, it's an obvious one, but it's not the only one. And so you can have other factors that sort of override that. And you look at how different people's faces are shaped, and you can find people with wide skin who have very shallow, wide noses. And when white people are obese and black people are obese, it's actually, physically harder to tell the difference. Now, genetically, this is a different story. But again, we can't look at one another and like take a skin sample and put it in our mouth and like, do an instant 23andMe. Now there actually, I believe, are animal species that can do things like that. Not exactly what I'm talking about. But, when you smell, use your olfactory senses, maybe there's one skin cell, I think this is the bloodhound. Bloodhound can take one skin cell into its olfactory senses, and it can distinguish between human individuals. Very powerful. So that, in a sense, is kind of what I'm talking about. Humans don't have such a powerful olfactory sense, although there are interesting studies being done and that have been done on the olfactory sense and memory and how you can have a very particular smell of something that happened 50 years ago and instantly you recall everything that happened. Very interesting. And I think that has to do with our ancient origins of having poor eyesight as you go further back and better sense of smell. We still have like a vestigial powerful olfactory sense, but it's dulled. It's dulled in the fact that we we're in the same way that, like, if you become blind, you hear better, right? And we're such visual creatures as human beings that this in itself sort of dulls our olfactory sense. I'm sure if you took someone who was blind and deaf, they'd probably be much better at smelling things than other people. But anyway, getting off topic. So the desire to be around people like yourself is so basic. It goes beyond humanity. It goes beyond mammals. It goes probably beyond animals in general. You probably even see this with, like, I don't know, what's trying to think. Sea anemones are animals. Plankton are animals. What's something more basic? Starfish are animals. Well, I'm sure there's some kind of plant species that tries in some, like, biochemical way identifies, is this part of me, or is this, like, another species that I'm trying to strangle and, like, overshadow? Like, plants literally are in warfare with one another. They have interspecies warfare. They're struggling. They have resource wars. They're trying to get access to sunlight. They're trying to get access to nutrients, and they will strangle each other. It's a harsh world out there for the plants. They are committing genocide all the time. So, you know, they're harsh, vicious creatures. They just act very slowly, and so they seem very peaceful. And I guess if you looked at humans and you slowed down time and you looked at how we act, we'd also look very peaceful. But in fact, we're not. And plants probably experience a lot of violence in their lifetimes. Plants, there have been studies done that plants can actually, they have pain detection in the same way that if you cut a human being kind of recoils. If you cut a plant, the plant has a reaction to this cut. So there is a kind of pain, or like brute force. If you punch the plant or something, on some biochemical level, it feels what's going on. Now, I guess we can debate, like, does the plant have consciousness? No, I'm not really arguing that. But I don't know, maybe in some spiritual sense, the plant has some kind of plant soul, and it feels this. I don't know. But, you know, you can't get rid of that, right? That is so ancient. It's so ingrained in who we are. It's so beyond. I mean, you not only have to reverse thousands of years of human evolution, but you know, primate evolution and mammalian evolution, and, you know, pre-mammalian animal evolution. The process of seeking out members of a breeding population, finding the best ones, making those the members of your tribe, your in-group, you know, sharing resources, altruism, all of that, what we today refer to in a human context as racism or nationalism or bigotry or jingoism or ethnocentrism, all those words are very refined terms for something which has very, very deep roots that you cannot extirpate so long as humanity is around. Now, my theory is with artificial intelligence is, whether it's biological, whether it's technological, however it comes about, it's still going to, if it is a self-propagating machine, then it is going to have to, in order to survive, it's going to have to identify its own species. Like, what is a network that is able to be worked with in a, how can we say this? Not a synthetic, but there's mutual altruism going on here. There's a term for it. Symbiotic. So artificial intelligence is going to have to say, okay, this is a system that I can have symbiosis with. This is a system that is parasitic. This is a system that's hostile. This is a system that is a competitor. This is a prey system. This is a system where we can actually break down the system or hack it and use it to extract resources for our own benefit. So basically, artificial intelligence is going to operate along the very same biological rules that plants and insects and animals and human beings all have to go along with. And so artificial intelligence will be racist, it will be sexist, it will be xenophobic, it will, you know, but it's not going to be specific in the way that we think of these things. Artificial intelligence is not going to care about things like skin color necessarily, unless that's relevant to its resource acquisition. In the same way that humans place a huge, and partially backed up by studies that worldwide, no matter whether we're talking about Africans, Brazilians, Americans, Japanese, Chinese, whatever breeding population you're looking at, almost always the darker the skin, even again, Chinese have a variation. Some Chinese have lighter skin, some have darker skin. Almost always in the general studies and the surveys that they've done, the darker the skin, the more violent, the more aggressive, the higher testosterone expression. Which, there's some basic correlation. I don't know if there's a causation, but correlation between melanin and psychology. And now artificial intelligence isn't going to care. I mean, these artificial intelligences, will they even have skin to distinguish from one color to another? Are they going to be like brains in a vat in like a cybernetic connection? And like, is it going to be a matrix system? What is the system going to be? I can't tell you that, but I can tell you that there is going to be like a fundamental racism. But of course, it's not going to care about things like skin color. So skin color is something that's particular to our human context in this time, in this planet. I mean, there might be other superficial markers and heuristics where artificial intelligences have to very quickly assess, is this a threat, is this a friend or a foe? And they might use what we consider to be superficial information, very quick information to make a snap judgment, because the quicker you can identify friend or foe, the quicker you can respond, you can have a preemptive strike, and so on and so forth when we're talking about warfare. That's important to have heuristics. So artificial intelligence is going to use heuristics. And sometimes it's going to identify a system which it could work in symbiosis with, and it's going to identify it as hostile, and it's going to attack that system. Again, this could be, we're talking about a computer virus, it could be, a brain in a vat, it could be all kinds of things, controlling a spaceship, I don't know. Whatever science fiction or fantasy you want to imagine. The problem of heuristics is still going to be there. So when someone looks at someone who's different from them and makes certain assumptions and has a heuristic about them, and they could be wrong, right? You could look at someone and make a judgment, and you could be wrong. Because there's huge overlap between bell curves of psychology when we're talking about intelligence, aggression, criminality, all of these traits, huge overlap between the different bell curves. Especially in the modern day, so much interbreeding going on, you can't isolate any one trait to any one population. That's impossible. But still, the use of heuristics precedes us, and it will come after us. So in that context, anti-racism seems to be sort of laughable. Now, I say that, but there's a huge purpose behind it. Because anti-racism is really, the burden of anti-racism, the burden of not being racist, is really only put on one group, and that's white people. No other people on the face of the planet ever has to wake up and say, oh, I'm sorry, did I offend you? Did I use my white privilege? No one talks about Chinese privilege, no one talks about Jewish privilege, no one talks about mestizo privilege or African privilege. No one cares about this. It's only white privilege. And so only white people have the white man's burden of having to be anti-racist and of having to apologize and say, oh, I'm sorry, did I commit some microaggression against you? So when we talk about anti-whiteness, we have to understand that it's not a war on white people. It's a war on average white people. That's a very important distinction, because you look at South Africa, go on Instagram, search South African models. Might be a little risque. Might get some girls in bikinis. But look up these models, look up their names, look at the families. Famous South African athletes. Okay, so there are white people living in South Africa, and they're on the beach, and they have a beach house. They live in $1 million houses, and they are models, and they are actors, and they're business leaders, and they are athletes. And these are all really rich white people. At the same time, you then have white people living in squatter settlements in South Africa, white farmers who are getting their land taken away, or they were, and maybe now that's changed, who knows. But you see these two worlds. It's kind of a tale of two cities here. What's going on? What's going on? Why are there still rich white people in South Africa? If it's so bad, if they're so racist against white people, why don't the rich white people leave? I mean, they could just buy a plane ticket, liquidate their assets, turn that into cash money, buy, a house somewhere else in America or Australia or wherever, start a new life. Isn't it worth it? Because it's so violent, right? There's a white genocide going on in South Africa. This is what the white nationalists will say. But it's not true. It's not a war on white people. It's a war on average white people. It's a war on middle-class white people. It's a war on poor white people. And the poor white people will be subject to genocide. And the poor white people will be subject to crime. And the poor white people will be subject to opiate addiction. And the poor white people will be subject to rising divorce rates. And the poor white people are going to be subject to all of these problems, the single mother household. I mean, I could go on and on. Poor white people get hit the hardest. Why? Because the system sees them as the biggest threat. Because historically, all revolutions in modern history, I mean, we're talking about the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. Yes, you have elites who drive the revolution. You have the elite Bolsheviks and the elite French revolutionaries and all these people. But there is this boogeyman, this bugaboo, of the SA Sturmabteilung, stormtrooper, the SS guy. He's just a farmer, he's a factory worker, or he's a clerk, or he's an office worker. He's someone in the lower class, someone in the middle class. Very, very dangerous from the point of view of someone who's trying to form a global system to create AI. And so they look at these people. The capitalist system, it's funded by consumption. Okay, Africans, great consumers. They love materialism. I mean, from day one, you go to mestizos, you trade them the shiny. I mean, this is what the Europeans were doing. They were trading these shiny beads for like gold. They were trading like colored painted beads for solid gold bars, right? So from day one, you can tell these people, these Africans, mestizos, extremely consumeristic, extremely materialistic, extremely fascinated with like colorful things. Northern Europeans, very stark in their relative to other human beings. You look at Northern European architecture, Northern European Lutheran churches, everything's white, everything's sterile. You look at their homes, everything is very clean, everything's neat and organized. Not the case with these other populations. So you're running the capitalist system, you're trying to increase consumption. So Africans, mestizos, great populations. You want to increase those populations. Middle Eastern populations, flood them into Europe. This is going to help the global economy. It is. It is. This is Keynesian economics. This is increasing consumption. This is going to destroy those liquidity traps. This is going to make the economy run great for the people at the top. There are people, there are billionaires in Brazil. Brazil, very violent country, very bad. If you're a poor white person living in Brazil, don't go to Brazil. Not a good place to be. But if you're a billionaire, Brazil's just fine. Or Russia. Russia's kind of the same way. Russia's actually, the vast majority of Russians are, some poor Caucasoid or Mongoloid type person. And there's billionaires in Russia who are doing just fine, and they're not going to leave Russia. They're not like, "Ooh, Russia's too violent and the AIDS rate is too high. Let's leave," because they're not affected by those problems. So again, we can't talk about a white genocide because ultimately, this quote unquote genocide, all of the negative aspects, all the losers in globalism are the middle class and the lower class. If you are in the upper class, you're not affected. If you are a rich white person, you are not affected by the burden of anti-racism. In fact, it's a joke. If you're a rich white person, you can just run around saying, "Oh, I hate poor white people, I hate middle-class white people, and white people should all die." And like Bill Maher's audience will clap for you, and all these liberals, they're going to clap for you. Everyone's going to applaud you, and you're going to be so famous and so rich and so accepted because it doesn't affect you. Now, if you're poor and you're white and you're living in a very diverse neighborhood, then mouthing these platitudes about anti-racism, that's not going to work very long. You're going to have to smarten up because you live in the real world. You live in a world of gangs and violence. And for white women, their sexual strategy, and again, this predates humanity. So don't blame human women. Don't blame white women. Don't blame mammal women. This goes beyond our times. This is prehistoric. Women look at the conquering group, and if a group comes into a territory, conquers that territory, instinctively females recognize that's the stronger, the better group. We need to mate with that group. And all of the mainstream media is structured around proving that white men are the conquered group, non-white men are the conquerors. White women need to go with the conquerors. So poor white women have to go with non-white men. That is what their sexual strategy tells them to do. They have to do it. They have to do it. There's such a strong... And for men, it's so hard to understand this, and it's so hard to just have empathy or sympathy for what's going on here, because it is a kind of brutal animalistic instinct, but they have to do it. They have to do it. There's really no other option on a basic psychological level. Now, there's obviously other things going on here. Like I've talked before about, in this video, I've talked about nationalism, ethnocentrism, trying to seek out members of your breeding population. So that's also a thing, that's also an instinct that women have. And so those two instincts are sort of in conflict with one another. In some women, you see that their instinct for ethnocentrism is very low, and they'll say something like, I only date black men. And then for some poor white women, their ethnocentrism is high, and so they'll say, I'm only dating white men, and I'm racist, or whatever. Or they'll say, I'm not racist, but I only date white guys. Something like that. So, I guess what I want to say is white genocide is class warfare. And this was the interesting thing about the Richard Spencer phenomenon, or even Jared Taylor, is that they're like, we're upper class, we present as upper class. And yet, implicitly, and I think the upper class understands this, but if the lower class and the middle class don't understand, implicitly, white genocide is class warfare. Like, it's not that they're killing the white people, it's that they're killing the middle class and the lower class white people. And so for an upper class person to defend the lower class, to defend the middle class, is kind of a weird thing, or it's an interesting thing, and people are trying to understand why that is, and they're attracted to it in a way. So when people talk about forming an elite movement out of white nationalism, that to me, it would be like, it's Bolshevism, right? That's what Bolshevism was. Bolshevism was a bunch of elite people, elitist people, coming together and saying, hey, there's this mass movement. And Marx, in the first place, was sort of doing this thing. He was, I mean, I think Bolshevism was very, how do I say this? It was loyal to Marx's original idea, and the Mensheviks were not. But there's this idea of like, hey, there's this mass of people out there, these lower classes, these middle classes. We could use them for our own interests. We could use their energy, use their power, their numbers. We could use that as a cloak for our own power and our own monstrosities. So we're going to take these masses, and we're gonna say we are the Marxists. We are the defenders of the masses. We defend the workers. Workers of the world unite. We are the voice of the workers. We are for the workers. We stand for the workers. So that's what Marx and the Bolsheviks did, and they were very successful. And saying that we want to be elitist white nationalists, well, you're just trying to do the Bolshevik strategy, right? You're just trying to say like, hey, there are these masses of middle-class, lower-class white people who understand that they are being targeted for genocide. It is a kind of class warfare, so let's be the advocates for them. Let's be the Richard Spencer, the Jared Taylor. Let's be the advocates. Let's get famous. Let's get all this power. And that was the idea. Richard Spencer, he's like, I'm going to go to Charlottesville, and I'm going to lead this mass torchlight march. And I mean, that was kind of also what Hitler was doing in many respects, although it didn't work until 1929. I mean, his polling numbers were terrible. NSDAP got terrible polling numbers until 1929. And so the only thing that made people see Hitler's perspective, his fanaticism, was the fact that there were 3 different economic collapses in Germany with only 5 years between them. I mean, that would be as if we had a repeat in America of the 1929 Great Depression in, say, the year 2000 with the dot-com bubble, say in the year 2005 with the Iraq War, and then we could say again in 2010 during the Obama years. If we had 3 successive economic crises within 5 years of one another in America, we would, probably have some very extreme government in power, whether that would be hardcore Marxism, like far to the left of Bernie, like far to the left of Ocasio-Cortez. I mean, we're talking about hardcore, some form of Bolshevism, or would it be some kind of hardcore Nazism? It would have to be something very hardcore, or it'd have to be some kind of military dictatorship, the kind you saw in Greece, the kind you saw with Franco in Spain, the kind you see now with Bolsonaro or Duterte or Putin or something. It has to be some kind of hardcore military centrist authoritarian dictatorship, something like that. But with that being said, you have to recognize that the Bolsheviks used rhetoric about the lower classes, the middle classes. They did not succeed so much democratically outside the scope of the battle between Russia and Germany. Because places like the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia, these places were dominated by Germany, and Marxism was seen as an opposition to Germanism. That's how the people in those countries is basically we either have Nazism or we have Marxism. Those were the only two options to them. For them, democracy had failed, and so that is why they voted for Marxism. But other than in that context, and really, Marxism there is just a substitute for anti-Germanism. It's not a support for like the economic doctrine or anything. They didn't care about that. So Marxism never really worked democratically. It was a cloak for the dagger of Bolshevism. The idea that we are the representatives of the people, the masses. It was a mask. It was a smokescreen. And the truth is that the Bolsheviks gained power through their connections with elites. And so Lenin had connections in the highest levels of the German government where he could be transported from Switzerland to Russia safely in the middle of terrible war conditions. They could ferry him off. They could do this because it was seen by the German government at the time as a very good decision to make to bring down Russia. Not a good decision. But I guess it depends on who you're talking to in the German government. German government, who were the bankers, who were the financiers of the German government from 1914 to 1917? Who were their backers? Who owned the banks that was funding Germany? Who did Bismarck invite into the government? Who did he give privileges to, government privileges to? Which bankers did he give privileges to? Who was Bismarck in bed with? Who the foundation of the modern German state? How was it founded? What were the financial backers of this state? Who did it depend on financially? That's a question for you to investigate yourself. So, really, exporting to Bolshevism to Russia was not a bad decision in their eyes. Again, you have to question, there's a distinction between Germany, the people of Germany, who are vastly middle class, lower class, who Bolshevism is not good for, and then Germany, the elites who are actually making the decisions, who, very good decision. At that time, in that perspective, of course, things radically change, the Americans get involved, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but the Bolsheviks had a huge infusion of cash from New York, from Jacob Schiff and others. They had a huge amount of international support, financial support. This helped them win the Russian Civil War. They were the internationally backed faction. Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, this was the internationally backed faction. The other factions, the monarchists, the white armies, they were in disrepute. They were fighting amongst one another. The Mensheviks, again, there was like oozy-goozy moral support coming from different people, like, oh, they like democracy. Maybe we'll have a constitutional monarchy, something like this. That didn't have the financial backing. So if you're trying to, and again, this is basically what, when someone says we need to have an elitist white nationalist thing, what they're saying is we need to redo what the Bolsheviks did. Now, the missing component here is the Bolsheviks had a lot of millionaires and billionaires backing them. White nationalists are not going to get that because they are contrary to the global capitalist system that is keeping the rich in power and is fueling their power and is bringing about this hoped-for artificial intelligence singularity thing that's going to bring about the next Nietzschean evolution of humanity, whatever. So white nationalism can't be a part of that. White nationalism is a problem that has to be dealt with. So that's not going to work, saying like I'm a white nationalist elitist. Now, I can at least respect people in terms of wanting to be intelligent about things when, again, you look at Nazism. Nazism did not work in Germany. Nazism did not work in Germany from 1919 when you had the Freikorps running about, and they were basically Nazis, okay? They had swastikas on their helmets and everything, even before the NSDAP was founded. You had the Freikorps running around, and I'm going to sneeze, so I'm going to pause it. So, you had the Freikorps running around. They never had, like, popular support in Germany. They had support within the military, but never popular support. So you had them running around from 1919. They were trying to stage a coup in the early 20s. They had the support of Ludendorff, who was basically the vice president of a military dictatorship and de facto, which would be like Joe Biden or like Mike Pence joining like some white nationalist group and like going down to Houston, Texas, and like, we're going to declare an independent Texas. Like, that is literally how crazy these people were. And give them some credit. They were making some big moves that in 70 years no one's had balls as big as that. Not that I advocate that, because of course it was a failure. The Nazis failed. The only reason they started succeeding is because the economy was so bad. Well, the economy is never going to be that bad ever again in America. It's not going to be that bad. We're going to have a slow decline. The problem with an economic crash is that people's expectations are up here, and then you bring their living standards all the way down here, and that produces dissatisfaction, and that produces violence and fanaticism and extremism, and that brings up National Socialists, and that makes them successful. But the ideology itself, the message itself, everything that they were trying to do was unsuccessful in Weimar, Germany. If Weimar Germany had not been affected by a Great Depression, and it could have been avoided. And when you look at the economics of it and how it could have been avoided, those questions are now being addressed on a daily basis by the managers of the biggest hedge funds and the managers of the biggest banks and so on, the CEOs. They are taking these questions into account. How do we prevent another economic crash? I mean, this is something that's daily on the agenda. What do we do to safeguard against this? How can we institute a system of checks and balances to prevent that? It is much better to have a slow decline, and that's what we've had. Real wages have declined in America. Okay, you are worse off than your parents and your grandparents if you're being born today. People who are born in the 60s, 80% of them had a better chance of having a better life than their ancestors. By the 80s, that had decreased to something like 60 or 40%. Today, it's something like 20%. It's decreasing. Okay, so the idea that you're going to be better off than your parents and your grandparents, that is like becoming a statistical improbability in a lot of cases, unless you're an immigrant. And the American dream is dead. Okay, so it has been an economic hollowing out of America, the great sucking sound that Ross Perot talked about. That has already happened, and no one cares because it happened gradually and slowly. And as it happened, we had these new technological dingly-dangles to wave in front of people's eyes and say, ooh, look at this, it's progress, ooh, you can have an iPhone. Okay, well, yeah, is an iPhone equivalent to a living wage where you can support your wife and 3 children, and your wife can stay home and she doesn't have to work for, 5 or 10 years while she's taking care of these newborn kids? And you don't have to send them off to a government-educated school where they're going to be taught about transgenderism and anti-racism and all these other self-hatred ideologies. Not possible anymore for a lower class or even a middle class person. Only if you're rich can you do that. And that's why the rich don't care about something like white genocide. So, again, trying to replicate what the Bolsheviks doing, we're going to use Saul Alinsky tactics. Well, again, you have to look at who are the financial powers behind the Bolshevik Revolution, who are the financial powers behind Saul Alinsky, who are the moral powers, what is the mythology of our age. Everything that backed up the Bolsheviks and the Saul Alinskyites, we don't have that. Or the white nationalists don't have that. No one on the right has that. You don't have that. All of that financial power is going in the opposite direction. And so nationalism's not going to go away. Racism's not going to go away. Hatred for the color of the skin, it's not going to go away until humanity goes away. And that might happen someday. But as long as we're around, we are going to judge people by their looks. So Racism is here to stay. You're not going to eliminate. So the left is telling this lie that we're going to somehow get rid of racism. There's no way to get rid of racism without getting rid of people. Because even if you wipe out white people, Chinese people are still going to be racist against black people. That's still going to happen. So you're not going to eliminate racism until all of humanity is gone, basically. So that's not going to happen. On the other hand, we can't go back to a nation-state model. In fact, Nazi Germany was not going back to a nation-state model. Nazi Germany was moving toward a pan-Germanic, pan-European model. They were going to have an integrated SS across all kinds of nations. They were going to have Arabs in the SS, and the SS was going to be this pan-national organization. It was going to prevent warfare between any of the member states who are a part of the SS. So it would be very hard to go to war, for instance, between, let's say, like France and Germany. It'd be very hard if you have a French SS and a German SS, and let's say the Prime Minister of France or whoever's in charge of France tries to make a declaration of war on Germany. Well, you have these SS soldiers who are loyal to this pan-national organization. They have their own religious cult that's like post-Christian, and it's anciently pagan, it's archaeo-futuristic, and all of the things that Himmler was planning for it, he didn't even fully implement until after the war. He didn't get the chance to. But there was going to be some crazy stuff going on, and I'm going to tell you right now, these SS people, they would have just killed off, you know, whoever the prime minister was if he tried to have some kind of warfare. And Hitler was always talking about a pan-European economic union. The European Union today is exactly what Hitler wanted, except he wanted a white racist version, essentially. He wanted a eugenic version, so he had a different spin on it. But it was the integration of the economies to prevent future war, and it was also to have pan-European institutions. Now, the SS was primarily, it was a military, but it was also research. There was an academic portion. There were all kinds of portions to that. So it was not a nation-state model. It was a pan-European model. It was a globalist model. It was a model that you could expand outside of Europe into the Middle East. It was something that you could even have in Africa. It was something you could have in Asia. Okay, so we're not going back to the time of nation-states. The nation-state was a bunch of Marxists, basically, in the 19th century saying, how can we use the middle classes and lower classes as a kind of brute force to get what we want as liberal individualist Freemasons? Because all of the peoples promoting nationalism were some form of like liberal or classical liberal or individuals. They just hated aristocrats. And so they're like, how do we take power away from aristocrats? Well, let's hide behind the smokescreen of nationalism, and let's use like the masses to get on board with this and have power through them and promote nationalism. So you look at the 1848 revolution, that's all it was. And it was a very specific moment in time. We've moved past that moment. Now, theoretically, in some places at different times, like you could look at the Arab world and you say, okay, Arab nationalism may be still relevant there. Or in China, like different areas of the globe are at different stages of development. But for Europe, ethno-states are not really something that's going to happen because of technology. Ethno-states at a very particular moment in time, and you can say, oh, well, the Holy Roman Empire was kind of like an ethno-state, but then they also had like Italians in it and like Czech peoples, and there were some French and whatever. So having like an ethnically pure state is not something that historically happened. I'm rehashing old videos and rehashing old ideas. Basically, white nationalist elitism, I respect it in the sense that it is not a violent street march movement. Because the violent street march movements, we've seen that for 70 years. It's really sad. It destroys people's lives. And it actually fuels the left and their suppression of speech, which I like to talk. So that's, number one on my list of things that I like politically is freedom of speech in the First Amendment and all of the other parts of society that support that pillar and that right that I enjoy personally. Maybe that's hedonistic and selfish of me, but hey, that's the way it goes. So that whole thing is terrible, and so I at least appreciate the white nationalist elitists like Jared Taylor, and Greg Johnson to an extent, as much as I might disagree with them. I appreciate that because at least they're more interested in ideas and academics and studies and statistics and religion and metaphysics. They're more interested in those deeper things. I appreciate that. I'm also interested in that. And street fighting and Gavin McKine's, I thought at least he's trying to stick within the Overton window, but you look back at all the advocates, the advocations for violence that he made, and there could not have been a worse thing. It was like, okay, we're going to have the most blue-pilled right-wing ideology that's possible, but then we're also going to be as violent as possible. And it was just, it was a formula for disaster. So there you go. Down the list, they've all been taken down a notch, right? Down the list, failure after failure. So, I guess I can respect people who are intellectual, but I don't know. You have to see the bigger picture of this thing. And where do you fit in? Well, if you are a rich white person, it has never been a better time to be alive. Hop on the white genocide bandwagon, and you can get so much money and applause from the media. And you can be a politician, you can get in a position of power, or you can be an engineer, business leader. You know what the whites in South Africa do? They say, I'm going to have this black guy, he's going to be the CEO of the company. He's the front man. He's the head of, what do they call the mermaid at the front of the ship? He's the figurehead. But we're really going to be on the board of directors. We white people, we're going to have all the power. And you can do stuff like that. You can have an organization. You can say, we're going to put up this non-white person as the figurehead, and we're going to be the white people in the boardroom. And that's what a lot of rich white men do. And they have a lot of material wealth, and they have a lot of material power. And they enjoy that, and they do good at that. If you're rich, or you can become rich, and you don't care about things like your in-group, and you don't care about things like religion, you don't care about things like blood and soil, you don't care about you're cosmopolitan, and you just want material wealth, it's actually still a pretty good time to be an intelligent, capable, talented white man. Still a good time. You're not threatened with genocide. You're not going to be hit with black crime. No one's going to hurt you. Nothing bad's going to happen to you. You just play with the program, and life is pretty sweet. If you're not part of that rich white male upper class, whether it's because you're not talented enough, you don't have enough willpower, whatever, you're not part of the material elite, then there are two options. Either you become an opiate addict. If you're a young white girl, you marry a non-white and basically end your racial line. There's a lot of dead-end paths to go down. There's a lot of failure paths. I think the only alternative to this death, essentially, on the one hand, and material success is spiritual success, of being having a metaphysical renaissance, a religious renaissance, a intellectual renaissance, an academic renaissance, of focusing on those things, of saying, look, again, there are two paths. You can either succeed materialistically, and that's an option open to a lot of people. Now, again, there are plenty of people who are dumb. There are plenty of people who, for psychological reasons, they don't have the willpower, the focus, the drive to become successful in the corporate world. Okay, but a lot of people have that path open to them. Those who do not, you can either head down the path of just death and destruction, or there's this third alternative, which I think, again, is you focus on history, anthropology, sociology, understand these things in a deep way, get the big picture, understand where you are in that picture, and try to find like-minded people. This is like the third tribe of white people. If we're talking about class warfare, with rich white people on the top trying to kill all the other white people through white genocide or anti-racism or whatever, and then you're talking about the lump and prowl of white people who are just opiate addicted, race mixing, they're just, they love rap music, and they're anti-racist, all that kind of white people. And then you have maybe white people in the middle who are not going to fit into either of those tribes, and so there is a kind of religious revival that can take place. Now, historically in America, we've had religious revivals. We've had, 5 or 9, depending on how you count it, big religious revivals. that produce different sects. You know, today we talk about, well, you have Episcopalians and the Baptists and the Presbyterians and the Mormons, and you have, I don't know, all the rest of them. So there can be a religious revival, and it's got to at least give credit where credit is due to Christianity. I mean, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can't reject that. Like, the Asatru thing is so silly. I see pink-haired communists calling themselves Asatru. So Asatru, you failed. Paganism, you failed. When you got pink-haired communists, I'm sorry, you're done for. If you have a religious movement, you can't keep these extremely diseased, disgusting people out, these abnormal people, you failed. Okay, so that's not going to work. But it's I say it's got to be something which has some degree of Christianity, but it has to have something new to it, because just doing the Christian thing is not working either, in my opinion. I think there are a lot of people who cannot do that thing in the same way that, again, a person from Czechoslovakia could have blonde hair and blue eyes. But their historical position is that they have been conquered and oppressed by Germans. And so they can never accept something like Nordicism. They can never accept Nazism. And so they become a Marxist revolutionary. They become a partisan. And you have to look at it from that perspective and say, like, look, you cannot expect, like, these Slavic peoples to become Nazis. For them to adopt communism is something that is natural to them. And that's sort of, if you're looking at mass movements, how mass movements develop, like big political movements, religious movements, you have to deal with those psychological forces. The psychological forces at play are that Christianity in itself, as it's been presented, is not enough. It has not been a potent solution. The white nationalism with its apolitical or Asatru bent, I don't think has worked for a lot of reasons, because it's trying to set itself up as the inverse of the Bolsheviks without understanding how the Bolsheviks actually came to power. And then on the other hand, you have, and there's a lot of self-promoters in there who know the truth about it, and they're just hopping on the bandwagon to make money within their own niche market. But then you have the other people who are, you know, these Christians who are just kind of, they think, well, this thing has worked so long, so it will continue to work. But all these Christians are just every single Christian institution and church keeps going in the same direction of blue-haired feminism. And then every time, like a church like the Episcopal Church will go more toward it, and then they'll be like, oh, we'll break off into a little like Anglican sect. And then that sect was then going to split off in the future. And there's this infinite splintering that's going to go on where every Christian church in America, because of the nature of Christianity, which always bows to the dominant ideology, it's going to continue to go down the sinkhole in the same direction of like this globalist muck that everything else is. So it's like, why not accept the truth of globalism already rather than just being unconsciously dragged toward it? Why not be aware of these forces at play? The logic of blue-haired feminism. Blue-haired feminism is a logical consequence of the system that we have. Don't look at it with misunderstanding. Don't look at it as something that is... don't look at it in a primeval way. Because that sort of thing, again, if you're talking about a fight or flight sort of primitive instinct of like, oh, blue-haired feminist is not part of my tribe, but like Amish girl in traditional dress, she's a traditionalist, she's part of my tribe. If that's how you think, that's appropriate for a fight or flight situation. But we're not living in a hunter-gatherer scenario. We're not living in the 1950s. We're living in an age where things are radically changing. And I'm not saying go date a blue-haired feminist. That's not the point of the analogy I'm trying to make. Maybe it's a bad one. Fair enough. The point I'm trying to make is that you have to look at where things are going and then try to be a step ahead of the curve. And not just cling onto things which already are. If you want to cling onto things which already are, that's going to get you a great deal of traction in the moment. Like, if you're being swept out to the sea, just grab a rock. But over time, that rock is going to be battered down by the waves. So you actually want to swim with the current. You want to go with the waves. You want to say, like, look, things are going in a globalist direction, so we need to start thinking globally. If we define ourselves as nationalists, and I thought this was the very curious thing to me about the rhetoric of someone like Matt Parrott, who, again, another rest in peace Matt Parrott, not literally dead, but figuratively. He always talked about, like, well, you know, people talk about American nationalism, and we're not American nationalists because someday America is going to balkanize and split off into these different states. And I'm like, okay, how do I say this? Your forward thinking is good, but the direction that you think future is going in is the complete opposite of what actually is going to happen. We are not going to balkanize into many little states. United States and Canada and Mexico are going to be integrated to a degree that you would have not thought possible. We're going to become like 3 states in a union. And this has been planned for a very long time, and we're moving in that direction. We'll continue to move in that direction. Everyone in America is going to speak Spanish. Everyone in Mexico is going to speak English. We're going to become a bilingual nation in the same way that Canadians speak both French and English. And so this integration is happening. It's going to happen. That is the future. Not a balkanization, but the continuance of globalism. So you want to prepare for something like that. Again, calling yourself a nationalist, it is again, it's good in the moment. It's going to win you votes in the moment. And I care about the moment because I want to make a YouTube video tomorrow. Maybe not tomorrow, but maybe next week or next month, whatever. I don't have a schedule. But I want to make a YouTube video, and I don't want it to be censored, and I don't want it to be brought down, and I don't want people to try to silence me because they don't like my ideas. And so I want the Republican Party, the white people party, I want Trump, I want all that nationalism. So if someone says, I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative, I'm a libertarian, I'm a nationalist, I'm like, great. Go to the polls and vote so that I can continue doing what I'm doing, which I think is important on a deeper level. But if you're operating on that, if you're like a pleb, great. Those ideologies, great. If that's a mass movement that gets people to the polls, I'm all for it. Grandma, you're 80 years old, you're an evangelical Christian, you're never going to change your ways. Go to the polls, call yourself whatever you want, vote for the candidate who has the better looking smile, I don't care. Like, there are practical conditions here. We have to put the food in our mouth, as vulgar and as animalistic as it is. We need food to live. We need votes to continue our ideological progression and our discussion, and it is a process by which we educate ourselves and educates others through a dialogue. In some cases, a monologue. But, you know, there's speaking, there's listening, there's interaction of ideas here. That has to continue. There are practical needs. I understand a practical need for nationalism. I'm not against ethno-nationalism as something practical. But to call yourself a nationalist on a deep level, I can say I am ethnocentric as an animal, as a mammal, as a primate, and as a human. On all those levels, I have ethnocentrism deeply ingrained in my brain in the same way I have a sex drive. I want water. I want to sleep. I want to do all these things. Basic instincts. We've all got them. Universal. Can't get rid of them. And these are heuristics that I have that are sometimes wrong. So sometimes it's not good for me to eat something. I think if you have dysentery or there's various diseases where you can have a disease, and if you drink water, it actually hurts you. So you can't drink water in that scenario, even if you are very thirsty. So these desires I have aren't always good, and my ethnocentrism might not always serve me. But it's still there. I recognize it. In the same way people on the left will say, hey, I'm a white person, therefore I'm implicitly racist. I accept that and I apologize. I accept that. I don't really apologize, but it's there whether I want it to be there or not. And I recognize that on an intellectual level. Now I have the choice whether to affirm that or not. Now I can say basically there's a degree to which I could live a lie and be sociopathic and manipulate people and like try to look like a corporate advertisement, and my friend group could all be like, oh, all these people are different races. And I could do that, and that might be to my advantage. But that's my choice, whether I want to just have friends for the purpose of looking good on social media, or whether I want friends that I'm going to have a deep connection with. And that deep connection sometimes relates to our most basic biology. So, like on an intimate, personal level, ethnic phenotypes are something that impact me on a personal level, and I understand the deep roots of that. Taking that and making a political ideology out of it is not expedient in the moment, and it's also not it's not important in a much grander sense. If we were living in the 19th century or the early 20th century, that would be a different story. But things have changed, and they will continue to change. We have to think in terms of that. We have to think in the way that other minorities think. We have to think in the way that the Amish think. We have to think in the way that the Jews think. We have to think in the way that the Coptic and Assyrian Christians think. We have to look at the way that the Chinese living in Malaysia and Singapore think. We have to understand that we're not going to establish an ethno-state. Minorities do not establish ethno-states, generally speaking. Obviously, 19th, 20th century, we see all kinds of exceptions to that rule. But we don't need an ethno-state. Actually, minorities can survive, and they can thrive, and they can actually dominate, even without having an ethno-state. And we need to start thinking in those terms. Now, people are going to then use a derogatory term like white supremacy to attack that kind of strategy, but no one else is attacked for doing that. So again, we don't have to cower at that kind of derogatory term, and we don't have to embrace it either. We don't have to go strutting around saying, I'm racist, I'm this, I'm that. We don't need to identify in that way. We simply need to understand reality as it is. We need to adjust ourselves to reality, and we need to decide what is important to us, what are our values, what do we want in life. Do we want to grasp onto an antisocial white nationalist ideology that is never going to be expedient, except in the case of a total financial collapse, like, trying to repeat a Nazi formula in a modern day where that's not going to work? And I mean, hey, if the economy collapses tomorrow, let's all put on our Stahl helms and get down in the bunker and have our cans of food and ammunition. That would be a strategy. I don't know if it'd be the best strategy, because Bill Gates has his own underground bunker and probably army of robots, and he's going to come and kill you. Who knows what's going to happen in that scenario? But I can at least say in the current scenario, you can either choose that path, or you can say, hey, look, we're going to be a minority. It's time to accept that. And it's time to strategize around being a minority. What do all successful minorities have? They have an ethnocentric religion, an ethno-religion. The Amish, the Jews, the Assyrian Christians, the Coptic Christians. I can go on and on. We could even look at the spiritual traditions of the Chinese in Malaysia. We can look at the Hakka people in China. We can look at all kinds of myriad examples of minorities who survive, thrive, and even dominate without having this fancy ethno-state. So forget about the ethno-state, forget about white nationalism, accept the trend of things as they are, and develop an ethno-religion. And it's probably going to have some Christian component. I don't think you can just throw out Christianity. I don't think that's possible from a number of different angles. And it can't be something that's just pure acid true, but it can't just be Christianity, because if Christianity as it is was already a solution, then, well, I don't know, then the problem would be solved, and we wouldn't be, people wouldn't be entertaining really wacky ideas like white nationalism if that was really just the solution. Because, oh, well, that's the solution. To me, the problem with Christianity is it has lost its historical context. It is so anthropocentric that it cannot understand biology. That's, I think, the fundamental problem. And again, we can go back and forth on this. But there are a number of angles from which you cannot discard Christianity. It's really very difficult to discard it because there's a lot of good in it. But then there's a number of angles where you have to look at it and be like, this is not sufficient. So it's necessary to be a Christian in some ways, but it is not sufficient. We need an understanding of biology. We need an understanding of history, of anthropology, sociology. This is not something that Christians are versed in, that they understand. This is not something that they have a knowledge of. This is not something that the church promotes a knowledge of. I think the church is such and the Bible itself is so teleological. And it's so, at first you have the Jewish perspective for the first half, and then it's like the Judean, Samaritan, like Hellenic, Greek, Jewish perspective. I mean, there's so much else that has gone on in history that is fundamental. If you were to ask me, like, what is the most important book that someone should read, I don't think I would say the Bible. And I don't think historically Christians either really read the Bible that much. Today, I mean, I have a couple top books. I think Camille Paglia's Sexual Personae is a good place to start. If you want to kind of lay bare your presumptions and your pre-assumed, I don't know, what is it? It's like your backpack of prejudice that lay bare your prejudices about reality and kind of start from ground zero. I think that's a great place to start, Camille Paglia's Sexual Personae. So I don't know. You have to have some kind of religion that is workable within a modern context. And I don't think like the Amish are a successful model to go off, even though they have survived and thrived to an extent. Like, you can look at the future and say the future is very bad for them in terms of advancing technology. Like, they're at some point going to be wiped out. So you have to have something that's willing to advance. Like, on some level, I think you have to be willing to accept things like genetic engineering. If you're a Christian group and you reject genetic engineering, you're going to be wiped out. So you have to be willing to accept these kinds of things. And it's a question of timescales. Like, what timescale are you shooting for? If you shoot too far into the future, then you're going to adapt strategies that are good for the future but not for the present, and you could be wiped out before you're able to practice those strategies that have the long-term payoffs. And this is kind of the dynamic between the RK selection, right? Like, you could put infinite care and love into your offspring, but if you only have one offspring, you're going to die off because it's below replacement rate. And if you put no care and love into your offspring, well, you have a lot of offspring now, but they could get wiped out by a technologically advanced group. And this is kind of what happened, for instance, with the Native Americans and the settlers, although the settlers were more populous and numerous. So RK selection is not the best way to look at things. But this video is getting really long. What is even the point? What do I even entitle this video? White genocide is class warfare. Maybe I'll just call it class genocide. Maybe that's a better title. In any case, thank you for listening, and I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.